Montana Territory, December of 1883. The wind howled low across the Bitterroot Valley, dragging curtains of snow over the frozen ground as Laurel Norwood stood alone at the edge of the train platform in Hamilton, arms wrapped tight around her wool coat. The train had pulled away 10 minutes ago, leaving nothing but the hiss of cooling iron and the ache in her chest that maybe no one was coming. Her boots crunched over packed snow as she stepped away from the tracks and toward the depot building, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She had not cried on the train, not through the long days from Missouri, not even when the woman across the aisle had whispered, "You must be brave, dear." But now, as the sky turned a deeper gray and the cold started to bite at her toes, she felt her throat tighten. He was supposed to be here. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, creased and worn from reading. A letter written in a careful, tidy hand. "Laurel, I'll be waiting in Hamilton. I've got a cabin, land, and a good name. I'll have soup on the fire and a ring in my hand. Yours, Thomas Vale." Laurel had answered his ad in the St. Louis Gazette. A mail-order bride, that was what they called her. Her father was gone, her brothers scattered east, and there was nothing left in St. Joseph but bad memories. She had come west for a new start, a home, and hopefully someone kind. But the sun was dipping low, and there was no sign of Thomas Vale. She sat on her trunk beside the depot wall, snow dusting her shoulders. Her fingers, red and trembling, clutched the wool scarf tighter around her neck. Her breath came out in cloudy puffs. She whispered under it, "Please come." A horse's hooves crunched over the snow. Laurel looked up. A man rode into view, tall in the saddle, his coat flapping open at the sides, a wide-brimmed hat weighted with snow. The moment he saw her, he swung down, his boots hitting the snow with a thud. Laurel Norwood. His voice was low, warm, breathless from the ride. She nodded, standing too fast, her knees stiff from the cold. "I am Thomas Vale. I am sorry I was not here when the train arrived. One of my calves broke through the ice on the creek this morning. I had to haul him out." He stepped forward, eyes searching hers, his breath visible in the air. "I brought something for the ride." He unstrapped a tin pail from his saddle and opened the lid. Steam curled out. "Chicken soup," he said, offering it to her. "Still hot." Laurel blinked, the scent hitting her like a memory, her mother's kitchen, warmth, safety. She took the pail in both hands, the heat seeping through her gloves. "Thank you," she whispered. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled something small wrapped in cloth, and unwrapped it there in front of her. A simple gold ring glinted in his palm. "I know we have not looked each other in the eye until now," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the wind, "but I meant every word I wrote. If you still want what we talked about, I would be proud to make you my wife." Laurel stared at the ring, then up at him. He was not polished, not a man of city manners. His jaw was rough with stubble, his coat patched, his gloves worn through at the thumb. But his eyes were steady and kind, the kind of eyes that did not flinch from trouble. "I came all this way," she said, voice cracking just a little. "I hoped you would be here." "I am here," he said, quiet and sure. She looked at the soup, then the ring, then back at him. "Then I will come with you." Thomas nodded once, a hard, relieved breath leaving him. He helped her onto the saddle behind him, securing her trunk with rope, then mounted. Laurel wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek to his back as they rode into the snow. The soup sloshed between them, still warm, tucked inside his coat. It was nearly dark when they reached the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, the windows lit with golden lamplight. Thomas swung off and lifted her down carefully, his hands lingering at her waist. "I made space for your things," he said, a bit shy now. "I was not sure if you would really come." "I did," she said, "and you did too." Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A fire snapped in the hearth. Laurel's eyes caught the table, 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and a folded cloth in the center with a single sprig of pine. "I wanted to ask properly," Thomas said, suddenly standing straighter. "Or as proper as I know how." He dropped to one knee, held the ring again between his calloused fingers. "Laurel Norwood, will you marry me?" Her breath caught, eyes stinging again, but not from the cold. "Yes," she said, voice trembling. "Yes, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Thomas stood, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then, gently, he touched her cheek with his knuckles. She leaned into it without thinking. He kissed her slow, careful, like he was afraid to rush her. But her hands found his shoulders, and she kissed him back, the warmth of it chasing out every last chill. That night, Laurel sat by the fire with her feet tucked under a blanket, the soup now in their bowls, the ring warm on her finger. Thomas sat beside her, his hand resting over hers. "I know we are strangers still," she said, "but this feels like the beginning of something good." He looked at her, eyes soft. "It does to me too." The morning broke pale and quiet over the valley, the kind of cold that sank into the bones and settled there. A thin skin of frost laced the corners of the window pane, and inside the cabin the fire had burned low, its glow soft and steady. Laurel sat at the table, brushing her damp hair out with her fingers, the comb still packed somewhere in her trunk. Her hands moved absently, her eyes following the slow drift of smoke through a crack in the walls chinking. Thomas was outside with the horses. She heard the muted thud of boots on packed earth and the soft creak of leather as he moved around the corral. He hadn't spoken much after the fire died down last night, just enough to show her where she could sleep and where he kept the water bucket, then let the silence settle between them like something sacred. She liked that he didn't fill the quiet with noise. She pulled on her shawl and stepped outside. The wind had stopped during the night, and now everything lay still and white beneath a sky the color of tin. Thomas stood a few yards away, tying a new rope to the fence post, his sleeves pushed to his elbows, breath rising in slow clouds. A bay gelding watched from the other side of the rail, ears twitching. "You need a hand?" she asked. He looked over his shoulder, a furrow between his brows easing when he saw her. "You ever worked with rope?" he asked. "Some. My brothers tried to teach me knots when I was little. I never got good at them." She walked closer, the snow crunching underfoot. "But I'm quick to learn." He handed her the end of the rope without hesitation. "Loop it through here, then pull this tight across the beam, like this." He demonstrated once, slow and patient. She followed his lead, fingers stiff from the cold but steady. "You're good at showing," she said. "I had a dog once that didn't take to words, had to learn to teach with my hands." He looked at her sidelong, just a flick of a glance. "You sleep warm enough." "I did." She paused. "The ticking in that mattress is softer than it looks. I filled it with cattail fluff last fall. Took near 2 days to gather enough." Laurel tied the last knot and stepped back. The rope held. "You know," she said, brushing snow from her skirt, "I didn't know what kind of man I'd find out here. The papers can say a lot of things." "I figured the same about you," he said, "but you stepped off that train like you'd already made up your mind." "I had." She looked at him directly. "I didn't come to be waited on or pitied. I came to build something that lasts." Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched her, eyes flicking across her face like he was still deciding which parts were real and which were wishful thinking. "You strike me as the kind that don't break easy," he said at last. She didn't smile, but her chin lifted just enough to show she'd taken it as praise. They worked side by side the rest of the morning, stacking wood near the door, brushing snow from the roofline, hauling water from the creek. They didn't say much more, but the rhythm of their labor fell into sync, simple and sure. When Laurel slipped once on the path and caught herself with one hand against the cabin wall, Thomas reached out instinctively, steadying her elbow with a firm grip. She didn't pull away. By midday, the light had shifted, casting long gray shadows on the snow. Inside, the cabin held the scent of warmed bread and pine smoke. Laurel stirred a pot on the hearth while Thomas shelled beans into a tin bowl at the table. "You always live alone out here?" she asked, not looking up. "Since my father passed," he said. "Before that, it was just the two of us. He came west after the war with nothing but a compass and a saddlebag." He paused, said there was peace in the wide places. "Did he find it?" "I think so." "He died with his boots off and a book in his hands." She turned from the hearth, watching him. "What kind of book?" "Scripture, mostly. Sometimes Whitman. He liked words that made the world feel bigger than it was." Laurel poured the stew into 2 bowls, her hands steady. "I used to be afraid of big places," she said. "Thought they meant you'd vanish in them." Thomas met her gaze. "You didn't vanish," he said quietly. "You found your way here." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the soft clink of spoons against metal. Afterward, he stood and reached for his coat. "I've got to check the west pasture before dark," he said. "Mind if I come?" He hesitated. It's rough walking. Snow's drifted high in some spots. "I've walked worse," she said. They saddled the gelding and another smaller mare from the lean-to. Laurel swung up without help and they rode west across the field, hooves muffled by the snow. The sun hovered low, washing the hills in amber. A coyote loped across the ridge in the distance, pausing once to look back. At the fence line, they dismounted. Thomas checked each post, tapping at the wire, eyes scanning the horizon. "You're cautious," she said. "Pays to be." Laurel walked a few paces ahead, letting the wind pull strands of hair loose from her braid. She turned back to him. "I never liked being looked after," she said. "But I don't mind being looked out for." Thomas stepped closer, the wind tugging at his collar. He didn't touch her, just stood near enough she could feel the warmth of him through the cold. "I won't ever take your strength from you," he said. "I don't need promises," she answered. "Just truth." "You'll have that," he said. Every day. They watched the light fade over the hills together, neither needing to say more. When they returned to the cabin, the sky had gone deep blue, the stars just beginning to show. Inside, Laurel lit the lamp while Thomas unbuckled his boots by the door. Neither of them spoke of tomorrow. There was plenty of time for that. Tonight, the fire burned steady, and the silence between them had settled into something shared. The days settled into a rhythm that neither Laurel nor Thomas named aloud. Mornings began before the sun crested the ridgeline, the sky still heavy with starlight. Laurel rose early, drawing water before the frost thawed, her breath clouding the air as she moved through the quiet. Thomas had already gone out by then most days, tending to the animals or walking the line of trees that marked the edge of their land. Laurel liked the hush of the early hours, the cabin still warm from the banked fire, her thoughts unhurried. She had begun to leave the door open just a crack when she cooked, letting the scent of rising dough or frying salt pork drift out into the cold so he'd know, wherever he was on the property, that it was time to come in. One morning he brought in a handful of feathers, damp and smelling faintly of the woods. He laid them on the table without a word, and Laurel looked at them, then at him. "Found a grouse tangled in a snare near the cedar stand," he said. "It got free before I reached it. These were left behind." She touched one feather, soft and gray-brown. "You keep things like that." "I keep what the land offers," he said. "Sometimes it's food, sometimes it's just something quiet to look at when the days stretch too long." Laurel turned one feather between her fingers. "My mother kept bits of lace in a jar, said it reminded her that even worn things could still be beautiful." Thomas glanced up from unlacing his boots. "You take after her?" "No," she said after a pause. "She lived mostly indoors. I always wanted something with space around it." That afternoon, Thomas asked her to ride with him west of the creek. The path was narrow there, winding through tall cottonwoods that hadn't yet shed their last leaves. Laurel kept her eyes on the horizon, where low hills rolled out like folded linen. He stopped near an outcropping of stone, dismounted, and tied the reins to a narrow sapling. She followed, brushing needles from her skirt. "I wanted to show you this," he said, leading her to a low rise behind the rocks. From there, the whole valley opened below them, the river catching the light like a sliver of glass, snow still clinging to the far side. Beyond the river, the land stretched flat and gold toward the mountains. The wind moved slow up there, rustling nothing but their breath. "Why here?" Laurel asked. "My father used to sit up here when things got hard." She didn't speak, just stood beside him, the wind tugging at her braid. He'd say, "If you can see far enough, the weight of things lifts a little." Laurel folded her arms against the cold. "You come here often?" "Not since he died." He looked at her. "Thought maybe I'd start again." They sat together on the rock, backs to the wind. Laurel pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Thomas didn't touch her, but he didn't move away either. After a long while, she said, "Back home, I always felt like I was waiting for something to change or end or start. I didn't know what." Thomas ran a hand along the edge of the stone. "And now, I don't feel that way here." He studied her face for a moment, then looked out at the valley again. "I built a second saddle rack in the lean-to," he said quietly. Wasn't sure if you'd want to stay long enough for it to matter. Laurel turned to him, her eyes steady. I'm not going anywhere. That night, the wind came up fierce, rattling the eaves and sending whorls of snow against the windows. Thomas added a log to the fire and stood back, watching the flames catch. Laurel sat nearby, mending a tear in one of her gloves. The lamplight cast her shadow long against the far wall. He turned to her, clearing his throat. I'll be building a root cellar come spring. Could use another set of hands to help dig. She didn't look up from her stitching. You asking for my help or offering me a place in the work? Both, he said after a pause. She nodded once, then set the glove down. I'll do it, and if there's planting to be done after, I know a few things about that too. Thomas stepped closer, his voice low. I've never had someone beside me in this kind of life. It's different knowing there's someone to share the weight. Laurel rose, her hands falling to her sides. I didn't come to be set apart. I came to build something with someone who'd stand beside me, not in front or behind. He looked at her, searching, as if making sure the truth of her words would hold. Then he reached for her hand, his fingers rough and warm. You're not alone here, Laurel, not now, not ever again. She didn't answer with words, just stepped in close and rested her head against his chest. His arms came around her, slow but certain. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside, there was only the fire, the hush of breath, and two people standing in the kind of quiet that doesn't ask to be filled. By late January, the snow had hardened into layers that crunched underfoot with a sound like breaking glass. The wind had dropped off for a stretch, leaving the valley wrapped in a brittle stillness. Laurel found herself marking time not by a calendar, there wasn't one in the cabin, but by the slow shift of daylight, how each evening lasted a minute or two longer than the one before. She had begun to keep a small ledger by the hearth, not for money, but for notes what they'd planted in the window box near the door, how many eggs the hens had yielded, where the wolves had passed near the fence. She didn't ask Thomas's permission. She simply did it, and when he noticed, he only nodded once and added a line of his own in careful script. Mended east gate, ground 2 frozen to reset post. They spoke more now, but never too much. Their words came in pieces, scattered between tasks. One afternoon, she found him sharpening a draw knife by the woodpile, sleeves pushed back to the elbow, sawdust crusted in the folds of his shirt. She stood watching for a moment before speaking. You ever think of building something more out here? She asked. Beyond what's needed, he kept honing the blade, testing its edge with a thumb. You mean like a shop or a barn? She shook her head. No, I mean something that's only made for the sake of making it. He paused, wiped the blade on a scrap of cloth. My mother used to press wildflowers in the pages of a dictionary, said it reminded her that not everything useful had to be practical. Laurel leaned against the post, wind lifting the edge of her sleeve. Do you remember what kind they were? Some purple asters, yellow arnica. One she just called Mountain Fire, bright red, shaped like a tongue. She folded her arms. I'd like to see one of those. You will, he said. Come spring, the whole ridge turns red with them. She didn't answer, but her mouth curved just briefly, and the silence that followed sat easy between them. That night, she found a space in the ledger and sketched a flower from memory broad petals, spindly stem. She didn't label it. Just left it there, a small promise in graphite. 3 days later, a rider came down from the north, coat stiff with frost, his gelding flecked with sweat. Thomas met him out front, voice low, while Laurel watched from the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. She couldn't make out the words, but she could see Thomas's jaw tighten, his fingers flex at his sides. When the rider left, Thomas came inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. There's a widow up near the canyon rim, he said. Name's Eunice Keller, her youngest took sick. Nearest helps 2 days out. Laurel pulled on her shawl. What does she need? Boiled linens. Broth, someone who knows how to keep fever from taking the whole house. Laurel didn't hesitate. Then we take what we've got and ride. He looked at her, brow furrowed. It's a hard trail. Rough even in good weather. I've known worse, she said. Let's pack. They rode out before sunset, with Laurel carrying wrapped jars in her saddlebag and a bundle of dried herbs tucked into her coat. Thomas kept a steady pace, glancing back only twice to make sure she was still with him. She didn't falter, By the time they reached the Keller homestead, the air had thinned and the light had gone pale and sharp. Laurel dismounted without waiting, boots slipping on the ice-slick path, and pushed open the crooked door. Inside, the heat was stifling. A boy no older than 6 lay curled on a cot, his skin flushed and damp. A woman knelt beside him, her face hollowed from sleeplessness. Laurel dropped to her knees and touched the boy's forehead. "You've done well to keep him warm," she said. "Let's see what else we can do." Through the night, she worked mixing tinctures, cooling cloths, whispering low instructions to Eunice while Thomas fed wood into the stove. He didn't speak unless spoken to, but once, when Laurel's hands began to tremble from exhaustion, he brought her a cup of warm water and held it steady while she drank. By dawn, the boy's fever had broken. He slept with his limbs loose, breath steady. Eunice wept quietly into her apron. Laurel just nodded once, her face unreadable. They rode home in silence, the sun rising at their backs. At the cabin, Thomas helped her down, then stopped her before she stepped inside. "You didn't have to go," he said. "You chose to." "I did," she said. He looked at her, then not just looked, but saw her, something softening beneath the quiet. "You belong here," he said. "Not because you came, because you stayed." Laurel stepped close, her fingers brushing the side of his hand. "Then let's not speak of belonging anymore. Let's speak of building." He didn't kiss her, not yet, but his hand turned in hers and he held it like something earned. By mid-February, the first thaw had begun. It came not as warmth, but as a softening. The snow lost its bite, and the icicles no longer rang against the eaves like glass chimes. The sound of dripping water returned, slow and steady from the cabin's corners, and Laurel began to leave the shutters cracked during the day to let the light stretch across the floorboards. Thomas built a frame for seed trays in the lean-to, using salvaged pine from a half-fallen fence. He worked quietly, sleeves rolled, sawdust clinging to his forearms. Laurel brought out the last of the dried squash seeds she had carried west in a folded scrap of muslin, labeled in her own hand. She laid them out on the table, pressing her thumb beside each one. "I brought these from Missouri," she said. "Didn't know where I'd plant them, but I couldn't leave them behind." Thomas picked one up, turning it over. "They'll take here. Ground's good once it wakes up. I want to plant them near the south side of the cabin." "There's more sun there." He nodded, then looked up. "You planning to stay through the growing season?" "I'm planning to stay through all of them." He didn't speak, but the corner of his mouth lifted the smallest degree, and he reached out, setting the seed gently back in her palm. That night, Thomas laid a new beam across the ceiling rafters, bracing it with care. Laurel watched from the hearth, needle paused above a patch she'd been mending on his coat. "You planning for something heavy?" she asked. "I'm thinking of building a loft, could use the space come autumn. Maybe for drying herbs or sleeping if we need it." She set the coat aside. "If we're talking about sleeping spaces, maybe we ought to stop pretending I'm just a guest here." He froze, hand still on the beam. "I've been waiting for you to say when," he said. "I just did." He climbed down from the stool, brushing his hands on his trousers. "If you're sure, I was sure the moment I stepped off the train and saw you holding that soup tin." He stepped toward her, and she met him halfway. When he kissed her this time, there was no hesitation. Her hands slid to his shoulders, his to her waist, and everything between them settled into place like a door clicking softly into its frame. The next morning, they rode into Hamilton under a sky the color of melting tin, the roads slick with thaw. Laurel wore her best wool, brushed clean and pinned at the throat with a small carved button Thomas had made from juniper. At the town clerk's office, they signed their names in the marriage ledger with ink that bled slightly on the page. No one asked questions. The clerk simply handed them a folded paper and wished them peace. Afterward, Thomas took her to a dry goods store at the edge of town, where he bought her a length of calico she'd admired through the window. He didn't say anything as he paid, but when he handed it to her, his eyes lingered on hers like he was still learning how to believe she was truly his. Back at the cabin, they unpacked slowly. Laurel set the calico aside for curtains she'd sew in the spring. Thomas hung a dried cluster of sage above the door. That night they shared the narrow bed without ceremony, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arm draped heavy across her hip. Outside, the snow continued to melt and a fox passed through the field silent and unseen. Days passed, then weeks. Laurel planted the squash seeds in pots by the window, their small green shoots curling toward the light. Thomas traded extra feed for a pair of goats from a neighbor to the east. They shared suppers and late mornings and the quiet satisfaction of work done side by side. When Laurel found a wild plum tree near the creek, she marked it with a strip of cloth, already thinking of jam and summer pies. One morning she woke before him. The light had changed again, softer now, and she lay still for a long moment, listening to his breathing, steady and deep. She reached for the ledger she kept near the bed and wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. "This is home." That spring, the squash bloomed. The goats kidded two strong, clumsy creatures with sharp voices and knobby knees. Thomas built a new pen, and Laurel stitched names into their collars with red thread. Together, they dug the root cellar, the earth giving way beneath their shovels, damp and rich with the promise of all that would come. And when the mountain fire bloomed in June, red as a wound, Thomas brought her a handful without a word and placed them on the table beside her ledger. She pressed them between the pages, flattening them with care. They never spoke about what they had lost before they found each other. There was no need. The silence between them had changed, no longer full of questions, but of understanding. Years later, when neighbors asked how long they'd been together, Laurel would glance toward Thomas, and he'd give the same quiet nod he had the day he first offered her his hand. "Since before the thaw," she'd say. "That's when the roots took hold, and they never left."